When love feels like danger, marriage, fear, and the hidden survival brain. When relationships collapse, our first instinct is moral judgment. Why would she go that far? That's irrational. That's not normal. The philosophy and psychology rarely begin with moral condemnation. They begin with a different inquiry. Is this behavior the result of malice or the repetition of fear? Human relationships are never constructed in the present alone, especially our most intimate bonds. Marriage does not begin at the wedding altar. It begins in the nervous system. It begins in childhood. For one person, marriage is a new chapter. For another, it is the reopening of an unfinished story. The spouse becomes both a present partner and, unconsciously, a symbolic figure from the past. Protector, critic, abandoner, judge. When that happens, love does not simply feel intimate, it feels risky. And when intimacy feels risky, survival strategies activate. Marriage as reenactment. In attachment theory, the marital relationship functions as a stage for reenactment. The emotional templates formed in childhood are replayed, often without awareness. This is not a conscious decision. It is the autonomic nervous system responding to perceived threat, a raised voice, a prolonged silence, a disappointed facial expression, objectively harmless but neurologically familiar. The question is not, why is she overreacting? The question is, what does this moment resemble in her emotional memory? In my framework, individuals tend to move along three relational pathways. When conflict arises, integration, freezing, or severance. Let's examine them structurally. 1. The integration pathway. Conflict without collapse. Individuals who have metabolized earlier wounds do not equate disagreement with abandonment. They experience conflict as part of relationship process, not proof of relational failure. Their internal dialogue sounds like this. This is uncomfortable, but the relationship itself is not. Under existential threat. Because of that cognitive framing, emotional arousal does not escalate into relational catastrophe. In marriage, this manifests as expressing emotion while regulating distance, assuming repair is possible after conflict, framing issues as us versus the problem, not me versus you. If a spouse raises their voice, they may step away temporarily, not to punish, but to regulate. They return. The relationship remains intact. This is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of resilience. 2. The freeze pathway, emotional shutdown. The freeze response is often misinterpreted as maturity. It is not. It is nervous system inhibition. When conflict signals appear, the individual does not argue. They stop feeling. Speech decreases. Response is narrowed to phrases like, "It's fine. I'm okay. Nothing's wrong." The problem is not solved, but the relationship superficially continues. To the partner, it feels like living with a wall. The danger of the freeze pathway is delayed detonation. Emotional accumulation without discharge eventually erupts, often unpredictably. 3. The severance pathway, cutting to survive. This pathway appears the most destructive, but from the inside, it is the most coherent. The core belief is simple. The deeper the bond, the greater the danger. Therefore, conflict is not interpreted as friction. It is interpreted as threat. In marital dynamics, this may look like sudden emotional distancing, abrupt communication cutoffs, silent treatment, or cold wars, rapid mention of separation or divorce, complete disengagement after minor disputes. These behaviors are not punishments. They are regulatory attempts. If a small argument triggers a memory of past instability, parental divorce, emotional chaos, alliance conflicts, the body reacts first. The mind explains later. The spouse is not consciously viewed as a parent, but neurologically, the spouse occupies a similar relational position. Constant proximity, high emotional expectation, inescapable during conflict. That combination activates attachment memory. Love paradoxically, becomes frightening. The extreme daughter-in-law phenomenon. In some family systems, this severance pathway extends beyond the marriage and manifests as total cutoff from in-laws. From the outside, it appears rude, immature, or hostile. From the inside, it is a boundary defense mechanism. 3 developmental patterns commonly converge. 1. Early relational rupture divorce. Emotional neglect. Unstable parental alliances. 2. Learned survival strategy. Eliminate relationship to eliminate threat. 3. Overinvestment in the spouse as the sole secure base. When the spouse becomes the only perceived safe attachment, anyone else, including parents-in-law, becomes unconsciously categorized as potential destabilizers. Without understanding this architecture, well-intentioned interventions worsen the situation. What makes it worse? Certain statements are neurologically inflammatory, even if logically reasonable, to the spouse. What did my parents do that was so wrong? Heard as, your fear is illegitimate. They're elders. Just tolerate it. Heard as, collapse yourself again. I'll mediate. Actually reinforces triangulation. To the daughter-in-law, we thought you were family. Heard as emotional debt collection. Didn't your parents teach you better? Direct strike at attachment wound. We'll just communicate through our son. Strengthens coalition tension. Even gifts or surprise visits can be misinterpreted not as warmth, but as boundary intrusion. Why? Because the nervous system does not distinguish between a turtle and a pot lid if it has been burned before. Prior threat sensitizes perception. When fear memory is encoded, resemblance is enough. Why explanation fails. Family members often assume clarity resolves misunderstanding. If we just explain, she'll understand. But explanation to a sensitized nervous system feels like persuasion. Persuasion feels like control. Control resembles past coercion. So the very act meant to soothe becomes escalation. Waiting passively does not help either. Time alone does not heal attachment injuries. It calcifies defensive structures. What actually creates change? Not argument, not moral pressure, not forced closeness, repeated safe experiences. The nervous system must learn through consistent, non-intrusive interaction that the present is not the past. This requires clear boundaries set by the spouse, not triangulation. Reduced emotional defensiveness from parents-in-law. No attempts to correct or fix through logic. Space without abandonment. Contact without intrusion. Recovery is not about proving who is right. It is about retraining survival patterns. Probability of recovery. This is the pragmatic question. Spontaneous recovery without structural change is rare. Perhaps 5–10%. Life transitions such as childbirth may temporarily soften defenses, but the underlying attachment architecture typically remains intact. If the couple gains awareness of the pattern and the spouse shifts from mediator to boundary setter, improvement becomes more plausible, approximately 25 and 35%. When long-term individual therapy is sustained, particularly trauma-informed attachment therapy, recovery potential rises further, possibly 40–50%. But stabilization is not quick. 2 to 5 years of consistent therapeutic engagement is common. The critical variable is not the in-law dynamic. It is whether the individual relearns relational safety at a neurological level. Extreme avoidance in marriage is rarely the absence of love. It is the presence of remembered danger. Until we shift the question from who is wrong to what fear is repeating, we will continue to treat symptoms instead of structure. Understanding is not indulgence. It is the minimum condition for repair. And in relationships governed by survival memory, what you refrain from doing may matter more than what you attempt to fix. When understanding is not enough, recovery, limits, and the ethics of staying At the end of our previous discussion, we arrived at a difficult but necessary insight. Extreme avoidance in marriage is rarely the absence of love. It is the presence of remembered danger. But once we understand that, a new and uncomfortable question emerges. If these behaviors are rooted in trauma, if they are survival strategies rather than moral failures, then what are we supposed to do with that knowledge? And even more practical, what are the chances of recovery? The problem with asking for a percentage. Here is something most families do not anticipate. When you ask what percentage of recovery is possible, the person at the center of the conflict does not hear data. She hears diagnosis. She does not hear statistics. She hears, "You are a problem to be fixed." She hears, "We have already decided you are abnormal." In that moment, something very old awakens. If her childhood included divorce, emotional instability, or being powerless while adults made irreversible decisions, then any attempt to categorize her, to measure her, can trigger that same helplessness. It is not about the accuracy of the numbers. It is about the structure of perception. If someone once burned their hand on a boiling pot, even a pot lid held near their face can feel like danger. Words like probability, normalization, treatment duration, 40–50% recovery, they may sound rational, but to a sensitized nervous system, they collapse into one message. Someone is analyzing me. Someone is trying to control me. And so the typical sequence appears. Defensiveness, counterattack, cutoff. Not because the data is wrong, but because the nervous system does not negotiate with statistics. Then, are these numbers meaningless? No, but they are not meant for her. These percentages are not persuasive tools. They are reality indicators for everyone else. They help a husband assess what he is facing. Parents adjust expectation. A couple determine what they are realistically able to endure. In other words, the numbers are not instructions for fixing someone. They are boundaries against self-deception. Without realistic assessment, families exhaust themselves in hope without structure. Recovery, what actually changes the odds. Spontaneous transformation without structural intervention is rare. In many cases, it is under 10%. Major life events, marriage, relocation, even childbirth can temporarily soften defenses. But without conscious restructuring, the underlying attachment architecture remains intact. When the husband shifts from mediator to boundary setter, when he stops triangulating and begins clearly defining relational limits, the probability of stabilization increases modestly. When long-term trauma-informed therapy is sustained, the likelihood improves further. But even then, progress is slow. 2 to 5 years is common, and that assumes voluntary participation. Here is a crucial point. Most individuals in this pattern do not seek therapy because they are curious about growth. They seek it when their current strategy collapses, when isolation becomes real, when divorce becomes imminent, when the old method no longer regulates anxiety. Treatment is often not a preference, but a last resort, when recovery becomes unlikely. There are structural conditions that sharply reduce the chance of repair. Ongoing, unresolved conflict with her own parents. Strong controlling dynamics toward the spouse. A fixed "I am the permanent victim" narrative. Refusal or premature termination of therapy. When multiple factors converge, the system hardens. In roughly 40–50% of severe cases, the structure becomes rigid rather than adaptive. This is not a moral verdict. It is a systems analysis. She is not evil. She is someone who learned only one reliable method. Cut the bond before the bond hurts you. But understanding that does not automatically create obligation. Understanding is not the same as endurance. This is where philosophy must enter. Buddhist thought teaches us to understand the roots of suffering, but it does not command us to remain inside destructive patterns. Confucian ethics speaks of harmony, but not harmony built upon the collapse of one individual. Stoic philosophy distinguishes between what we can control and what we cannot. Another person's attachment structure is not within our control. So we must ask a question that is both ethical and practical. Is this marriage still structurally recoverable? Or has it become a mechanism that consumes the entire family system? This is not a question meant to judge her. It is a question meant to protect the son. When is divorce a legitimate recommendation? Advising divorce is neither automatically cruel nor automatically justified. It depends on structure. It may become ethically defensible when several conditions converge. 1. The son is in chronic psychological depletion, persistent depression, self-blame, emotional exhaustion, and the marriage survives only if he cuts off his entire family. 2. She refuses all therapeutic intervention and denies the existence of structural problems. 3. Childbearing is rejected not from personal preference, but as a mechanism of control to prevent any relational expansion beyond the dyad. 4. The marriage functions primarily as an anxiety regulation device for one partner, rather than as a mutual partnership. Under these conditions, suggesting divorce is not abandonment. It may be protected, but the manner matters. Force is violence. Emotional condemnation is violence. Ultimatums are violence. What is not violence is this: we are not trying to break your marriage. We are concerned that you are disappearing inside it. The decision is yours, but we need to be honest about what this structure is doing to you. That is not coercion. It is clarity. The child question. In some extreme dynamics, childbirth is refused not merely as a lifestyle choice, but as a structural defense. A child may be unconsciously perceived as a bridge back to the in-laws, a rival for the spouse's attention, a mirror that exposes internal instability, a bargaining instrument. When childbirth becomes leverage, the issue is not reproduction. It is control architecture. Modern context matters. In ancient societies, severing bonds threatened survival. In modern societies, economic independence, legal divorce, and nuclear family structures make separation viable, sometimes rational. When adolescent trauma intersects with modern autonomy, cutoff can feel not pathological, but optimized. This is why simplistic moral framing fails. The final ethical threshold. We have spent this entire discussion advocating understanding. But philosophy demands something more difficult: limits. Empathy does not require self-erasure. Compassion does not require collective collapse. Helping someone heal and permitting an entire family to disintegrate are not the same action. So the ultimate question is not, can she be fixed? It is, how much structural damage are we willing to absorb? This is not cruelty. It is stewardship. If you have followed this analysis to this point, you have already moved beyond blame and into structural thinking. In the next lecture, we will move even deeper into triangulation dynamics, why some conflicts are never addressed directly, and how extended family systems become psychological battlegrounds without anyone fully understanding why. Because relationships begin in emotion, but they endure only through clarity, boundaries, and deliberate choice.